Let's consider a scenario. We are withdrawing from the UN and asking them to leave New York. Beijing comes in and says, "We have a nice building for you." And now all the countries are going to Beijing, not New York. The witness on the other side gave an unexpected answer to this question. Without America, the UN is not the same prize for China. Without America, it would be a fundamentally different organization. I think no one wants to go to Beijing as much as New York. And the parking would definitely be much better. But before the joke, there was a serious observation. The fear of China taking over the UN has condemned Washington to this institution for years. This "we can't let it sink" syndrome is destroying our negotiating power. We can't let this sinking ship syndrome go. If you watch this video until the end, you will see how the argument that makes that determination possible is constructed. Jared Moskowitz, representative of Florida's 23rd District, senior minority member of the Intelligence and Oversight Subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And what made this stance remarkable was that Moskowitz was not taking an anti-UN position. On the contrary, he shifted the debate between supporters and critics of the UN into the framework of leverage and reform. If you want to follow this issue, subscribe now, because this session was one of the most comprehensive discussions of UN financing and reform, not in the executive body, but in front of Congress. Hamas letter, no response. Moskowitz recorded a concrete document at the opening. In a letter sent to the United Nations Secretary General on September 23, 2025, calling for Hamas to be officially recognized as a terrorist organization, the response received more than a month later only mentioned calls for peace and ceasefire without addressing the fundamental question at all. This led to the criticism that the UN wants peace but refuses to name the enemy of peace. This was the first and most concrete contradiction of that morning. Iran and the weapons platform. Moskowitz provided another example. Iran was included in a UN panel discussing nuclear weapons proliferation. Moskowitz turned to the witness. Did any UN officials criticize this decision? Witness. The role of UN officials is to work with the 193 member states. They are not in a position to express opinions. Moskowitz. The UN Secretary General makes numerous statements about events in the Middle East. But when Iran was brought to this panel, there was not a single comment. And at this point, the situation took a different turn. He could have even made a mild criticism. He could have said, "We respect the election process, but there could have been better alternatives." They didn't say anything. They didn't say anything. Percentage 25 in impact. Moskowitz turned to another witness, Jared. I'm looking at the U.S. spending on the UN. Is this increase in spending proportional to other donors, or is it an anomaly? Jared. The U.S. funding for the UN has generally increased at the same rate as other donors. In fact, voluntary contributions are shaped in a coordinated manner according to the roles of member states in determining their spheres of influence. Moskowitz took this statement. Identifying spheres of influence. This is the key word. Countries use voluntary funding for influence at the UN. We spend more. But is our influence proportional to this spending? But is our influence proportional to this expenditure? What if we leave? Script. Moskowitz moved on to his final topic. I want to think of a scenario. It may not be realistic, but it's interesting. Here's a scenario. We're withdrawing from the UN. We want them to leave New York. And Beijing comes in and says, "We have a nice building for you." All countries are turning to Beijing, the capital of China, instead of New York. And when asked what a scenario would mean where China starts covering 70% of the United Nations budget, witness Eugene Kontorovich said he thought this was outside the realistic political horizon and therefore generally did not consider such a possibility. But I have to say, the argument that if America goes, China takes over everything is a big fallacy in Western policy. But I must say this, the argument that if America goes, China will take over everything is a major misconception in Western policy. Not the same reward. And at this point, the most important statement of that morning came. Without America, the UN is not the same prize for China. The prestige, weight, and legitimacy of the UN largely come from the endorsement of the United States. If the United States withdraws, what China would inherit is not the strong UN we know, a legitimacy-less, financially bankrupt, hollow shell. Moreover, I don't think anyone would want to go to Beijing as much as they would want to go to New York. And the parking would definitely be much better. And the parking lot would definitely be much better. We can't let it sunk syndrome. Kontravich deepened Moskowitz's scenario even further. The fear that China will take over the UN has been used as a hostage point in Western politics for decades. But we need to ask this. This fear has reached the point of we can no longer leave from there. And if the other side knows that you can't leave from there, what happens? You have lost your negotiating power. The syndrome of we can't let the UN sink is becoming the biggest obstacle to holding the UN accountable. And Moskowitz reached this conclusion. Completely ruling out an option from the start in negotiations is a disaster. I completely agree with this. It seems you haven't provided the text you'd like me to translate. Could you please share the text? If you've watched this far, hit the like button, because the next episode will now cover the background of this hearing, the UN's anti-Semitism debate and the bipartisan context. Anti-Semitism at the UN, broad context. According to the Cleveland Jewish News/JNS, during this session, Moskowitz also brought up anti-Semitism at the UN. The widespread anti-Semitism that exists within UN bodies and agencies, independent of their relations with Israel, is concerning. UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, a name sanctioned by the US, about whom she said, "The UN still refuses to deal with her." This was not just about the Israel-Hamas war, but a broader critique of institutional double standards. Other witnesses' views. Other witnesses also made critical observations during the trial. It was reported that a blank check for $2 billion was issued for the UN's Humanitarian Coordination Office. The US did not have the authority to direct these funds to specific organizations. It was proposed to completely shut down UNRWA. It is problematic not only because of the presence of members of terrorist organizations, but also due to its extreme inefficiency. It was emphasized that Hamas and Hezbollah are not on the UN Consolidated Sanctions list. This table formed the backdrop for Moskowitz's leverage argument. Bipartisan context. This hearing took place during a period of rising bipartisan concerns about the United Nations, as Jared Moskowitz had previously co-sponsored a resolution with Republicans against the UN decision that had listed the Israel Defense Forces as child abusers. Additionally, proposals to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization had received bipartisan support. Therefore, the questions during the hearing were fueled not only by partisan opposition to the UN, but also by a broader discussion on funding and accountability. Permanent record. This hearing has gone into the official record of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Hamas letter and its silence, on the record. Iran's arms panel and the UN silence, on the record. UN is not the same prize for China without America, on the record. The "we can't let it sink" syndrome is undermining our negotiating power, on record. Conclusion. A parking lot would have been much better. Moskowitz asked a single fundamental question in different ways that morning. Is the UN listening to us? Or do they not have to listen because there is an automatic flow of funding? The Hamas letter went unanswered. Iran is on the panel. The double standard continues. And Moskowitz turned this picture into a leverage debate with the question, what if we pull out? Kontravich's response placed that question within a real strategic argument. Without America, the UN is not a valuable prize for China. Rather, it is an illegitimate empty shell. And the line, a parking space would definitely be much better, concluded this heavy argument in the simplest terms.